Hi, everybody. Welcome to week number 3, lecture number 1. Week number 3 sounds like we're really early in the course, when in fact, because we're doing 2 lectures per week, 6 hours or 6 credit hours of the course per week, then it's actually double that. So in our 3rd week, it's like we're almost at the middle of the course already. It's unbelievable how these summer courses go. So if you're feeling overloaded with material from this particular course, I apologize, but that's why, because you're doing the class much quicker, but the same amount of engagement, the same amount of reading, and same amount of lectures and so on. Last week, we focused on Marshall McLuhan for 2 classes, which, if this were a regular non-summer course, then it would be for 2 weeks that we were engaging with Marshall McLuhan. So it is quite the dose of McLuhan. So this week we're shifting gears a little bit. I'm not going to return to Marshall McLuhan this week, although I fully expect to return to McLuhan in other weeks for a particular reason. I want to compare and contrast some of the various schools of, let's say, sociology or schools of media studies, and to show how they analyze media and what the benefits of these different orientations are and what the drawbacks are of each. So maybe what I'd ultimately do at some point in the course is produce something of a chart, and maybe even I'll touch just a little bit more on what I mean by that before today. But before turning to today's material, I do want to make a comment about something that struck me in the last 2 weeks of classes. On YouTube, I, of course, get detailed analytics about the viewers of these lecture videos that I'm posting, and so what I noticed is that I don't actually see that there are many of you watching these lecture videos. There's few of you opening the lecture videos, and even fewer watching beyond a minute or 2 or 3 minutes. And those of you who are watching the videos, you tend to kind of jump around the video instead of listening to the whole video. So what I've seen is that only 20% of people who are even opening the video, which means that I'm talking about less than 20% of the students enrolled in this course, only around 20% of you have actually been watching the lecture videos. And that even includes the very first video where I'm outlining the syllabus and stuff like that. Okay, I get it. I know things are really hard right now. And I imagine some of you expect to look at the videos at the last minute, perhaps right before you go to do an assignment, thinking you'll only look at the videos that are important for your assignment and so on. I can understand the logic of that, but I should let you know that I really don't believe you can do well in this course without watching the lectures. And I know it can be a little irritating to listen to a traditional sort of lecture style, especially one where there's, I admit, sometimes a lot of abstraction, some even moments where I myself demonstrate confusion and so on, which is totally a part of my pedagogical style, believe it or not. And I could talk at length about why I think that's important, but I'll forego that. It's absolutely essential in order to complete the assignments for this course, especially the case studies. I really cannot imagine anybody doing well without watching the lecture videos. And what I find difficult here is that me delivering this message is coming to you through the lecture video, which some of you may not even hear. So I did send out an announcement on this too, but I guess I just want to really highlight how important it is. So, the way I look at it is like this. I know it's hard to watch these videos. I absolutely know, beyond 3 minutes, I can't remember what the exact number is, but somebody calculated it. Beyond a certain threshold of around 3 minutes, we lose our attention unless there's some interaction, some participation, and so on. That's what happens in the age of cool media. But so I get that, but think about it like this. I'm trying to give you a lot of ease in this course. I have extremely flexible deadlines, I think a really fair, flexible deadline policy. And I'm giving you readings that I permit you to many times not even read, but most of the ones that I do highlight that you should read, I intentionally tell you skim them. You know, you're reading them somewhat fast because the real substance is really in the lectures, and the readings, although you should read them, it's kind of supplemental to the lectures, as I've said in other lecture videos. So, you know, the price you pay for this flexibility in the course is that you must at least engage with the lectures. So, you know, with ease also comes some of a burden instead of the other way. People always say with burden comes ease. With ease comes a burden in this case. Okay, so please take it serious before it's too late. You know, the worst would be if at the end of the course, all of a sudden, you know, oh, you know, you didn't do well on the assignment, you misunderstood an assignment, you misunderstood fundamentally some particular concept or something like that. And, you know, at that point, it's kind of too late to go back and listen to hours and hours and hours of lecture videos, right? So it's important to take it as they come, you know, but you do have a lot of opportunities to take breaks and stuff like that while you're watching. So you have a lot of control, but the burden is on you to do that in whatever way is convenient for you. Okay, so this week we're going to discuss, forgive me, I want to make sure I'm using the right mic. Yes, I am. Okay. We're going to discuss film as a popular medium of culture, or film as a medium of popular culture, if you like. So for the moment, we're putting this media ecology stuff, or this media ecology approach, we're putting it to the side, although certainly we will return to it probably a couple times, perhaps later this week or early next week when I interview Andrew McLuhan. We'll be returning to it quite explicitly there. But what we're doing this week is we're opening up, let's say, something of a fundamentally different theoretical and conceptual framework for studying the media. And in this case, film, but it could be applied to other media as well, and not just film. And it's the approach of a particular contemporary figure whose name is Slavoj Zizek. That's how you pronounce it, Zizek. People often have a hard time pronouncing it in the Anglophone world. It has these little marks, but I don't know what they're called in Slovenian. So he's a contemporary sociologist, a contemporary cultural commentator, a contemporary philosopher, if you like. He's a professor of sociology at Birkbeck Institute, but he's a professor at a number of other universities as well at the same time. So we're going to be looking at his work, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but some of the things that we're looking at this week are listed in the syllabus. I'm not going to write them out here, but we're going to look a little bit at his book, Looking Awry, An Introduction to Jacques Lacan Through Popular Culture, which is a really engaging book that Zizek wrote on film and other aspects of popular culture to kind of demonstrate the importance of a particular school of thinking within media studies. We might comment upon a film by Charlie Chaplin, namely Modern Times. So you can watch that if you like. I'll tell you right now, it's optional to watch this film, Modern Times. You don't have to watch it. The truth is that I put this film on the syllabus because I think in terms of its content, in terms of the story, it's very clear that this entire film is about the themes we were talking about in the first week of class, namely modernity. And what's going on in modernity? Crowds of people in the street, exploitation of workers, bureaucracy, and so on and so on. So you can watch it and use it as an example of something in one of your assignments if you like, or on the discussion board. So, but again, it's optional. You don't have to watch it. Next, there's a documentary, A Pervert's Guide to Cinema, which this is required watching. You must watch this. Watch it as if it's a text that you have to read for this course, because the most important ideas, I think, are in there. And I think it illustrates quite well Slavoj Zizek's media theory, or theories, if you like. And then we have a sort of some secondary literature on Slavoj Zizek's film theory. really just one short chapter by a colleague of mine, a Canadian professor named Matthew Flisfetter, from his book, which I wrote a review and published a review of this book many years ago. The book is titled The Symbolic, the Sublime, and Slavoj Zizek's Theory of Film. And we'll just be looking, I'm just encouraging you to look at the first part of this. So what is required, what's not required in terms of reading after this lecture? What's absolutely required is that you watch A Pervert's Guide to Cinema. That's required. There's no getting around it. Second, I encourage you to skim very quickly if you like, or more rigorously read it if you so wish. The Symbolic, the Sublime, and Slavoj Zizek's Theory of Film, that first chapter that I've posted on Blackboard. Modern Times is totally optional to watch. You don't have to watch it. And Looking Awry, totally optional. I just put it on there to give you a sense of Slavoj Zizek's writing style and some of his really deep and difficult ideas. So if you're feeling really courageous, you can read that. But again, that one's optional. Okay, so, but, you know, when you hear me talk about the material for this week, I'm sure you're imagining this is quite a chunk of material, and indeed it is quite a chunk of material for one lecture. And it's, you know, it's technically, it's not even for 1 week of lectures, it's just for this lecture. So we may need to stretch it out a bit and pick it up again in another class, but thankfully, when Andrew McLuhan is being interviewed, we won't have any readings for that particular course module. Okay, so what is Slavoj Zizek's theory of film? Well, let's begin with a few brief words on Slavoj Zizek. Slavoj Zizek is, as I said, a philosopher of sorts, a cultural commentator. He's perhaps the most famous philosopher and cultural, or we would say public intellectual, if you like, in the world today, other than somebody named Judith Butler. I think there's Judith Butler and then there's Slavoj Zizek, and it's debatable who's the better philosopher. I don't, you know, we shouldn't really think in those terms. Zizek is without a doubt the most controversial of the most popular philosophers. He's a very controversial thinker. People love him and people hate him. He certainly has a cult following, and he also has people who are very antagonistic to his ideas. Some of you may know that he was recently, and this was actually organized by Matthew Flisfetter, the author of one of the chapters for this week. There was a debate in Toronto between him and Jordan Peterson, the Canadian public intellectual of sorts, maybe 2 years ago or thereabouts. Okay, so Slavoj Zizek, he was born in Slovenia, Ljubljana, so he's of Slovenian origin, and he makes use of the psychoanalytic work of Jacques Lacan, whose name I mentioned it briefly in another class. If you want to know the truth, he works through 3 bodies of scholarly work: the work of Jacques Lacan, the work of a philosopher named Hegel, and the work of Karl Marx. And he kind of brings them all together. So he's kind of working at the intersection of these 3 domains. You might say the clinic, the psychoanalytic clinic in the case of Jacques Lacan, the world of politics in the case of Karl Marx, and the world of philosophy in the case of Hegel. If Marshall McLuhan and his colleagues, Harold Innis and so on, if they are a part of the Toronto School of Media Studies, of Sociology even, which is what we've claimed in a previous class, you know, we have the Toronto School, then we could say Slavoj Zizek is a part of the Slovenian School of Media Studies, of Sociology, and we could even say a philosophy. It's really interdisciplinary stuff. So on the one hand, we certainly have the Toronto School, and we've explored it for 2 modules, for 2 weeks, the school of Marshall McLuhan and that approach to studying the media. On the other hand, now we're dipping into a different orientation known as the Slovenian School. And if there's in the Toronto school, there's Marshall McLuhan, Harold Innis, Carpenter, and numerous others that make up that school. The Slovenian school is made up of Slavoj Zizek. There's a few other names here, but I'm just going to give you the main three. A person by the name of Alenka Suponcic, who's a wonderful thinker, published many books. One actually published a seminal book on Friedrich Nietzsche. I think it was titled, was it The Shortest Shadow? I think was the name of that book. I might be wrong. You might want to fact check me on that. And Mladen Dolar. The three of them have a very similar approach to media, to sociology, to philosophy, indeed to psychoanalysis even. And we call this the Slovenian school. Forgive me. Okay. Well, I shouldn't hide the fact that Slavoj is a close friend of mine. We regularly engage in all sorts of conversations, debates, and so on. He was at one time my supervising professor for one of my PhDs in Switzerland, where I worked as his teaching assistant at that time. So I have a particular vantage point on his work that might be a little different than what you might hear from others. In fact, we just had an open debate, Slavoj and I, on some political questions that was published in the last week. Okay, so let's begin. But let's begin by just opening up the question of how the Slovenian school of media is different from the Toronto school of media. There's all kinds of differences, first off, I should let you know, and I will explore those in another class. For now, I just want to point at one, I think, the most central difference between the two approaches to the media. If McLuhan, maybe I should bring up a whiteboard for this too. So let's say the Toronto school over here, and the Slovenian school over here. And of course, we have as the key thinker, Marshall McLuhan over here. And as our exemplary thinker in the Slovenian school, it's Slavoj Zizek over here. What is the difference between these two approaches? The most central one is that Marshall McLuhan adopted a formal, or formalist, if you like, I'm going to say formal, approach or analysis of the media. So he had a formal analysis. He's interested in media as form. In other words, media as environment. You remember it was exemplified in his statement, the media is the message, or the media is the message, which means, once again, to remind you that the very form of media should be studied in terms of how it, as a mass, changes our social relationships in space and time. That's what it means to adopt a formal analysis. That's media ecology, right? So remember, I said it doesn't matter what's written in the newspaper, what the debates are, what the ideas are, what the facts are even. That doesn't matter. What matters is what newspaper does to our social relationships in space and time. And I gave the example of radio, what radio does to our social relationships in space and time, what social media does to our social relationships in space and time. To engage at that level is to engage a formal analysis, which is the orientation or the scope of analysis that we find in the Toronto school. You find it also in Harold Innis. I'll give you a quick example of where you find it in Harold Innis. Why not, since I'm being spontaneous. Harold Innis, we're going to study Harold Innis in another module, but he described the way in which social bonds are formed based on how heavy your money is. I mean, I'm making it very simple, but think about it. If you have really heavy stones or coins as the basis of or blocks of gold as the basis of your economy, then to use the money to buy things like, I don't know, some of this, you need to live close because it's heavy. It sounds funny, but it's true. It's heavy. So your social bonds you're gonna be closer to one another. You're gonna be tighter, more densely packed, because you need to live close to the marketplace in a sense. When your currency becomes lighter, paper light, or let's say virtual like Bitcoin, well, you can spread out pretty far in the world and still engage in the market, right? So you can all of a sudden have a sort of population explosion where people are very far from one another, but there's still some sort of means of social interaction. This is the sort of stuff Harold Innis was focusing on. It's a very formal analysis of the media, in this case, money as media, as what mediates our social relationships in space and time. Okay, but what about the Slovenian school? The Slovenian school, with Slavoj Zizek as our example, does something a little bit different and more complicated. You might say if they're not looking at the form of media, then they must be looking at the content, because that's all that's left. That's not true, in fact, or it's only slightly true. It's much more complicated than that. What is it? I'm going to put it in the most abstract way, and then we'll get to the clearer version of it before the end of the lecture. This is how things tend to work in my classes. What is it about the content of the media that can demonstrate something essential about the very form of media? So the content is what actually gives rise to an analysis of the form, right? Which is different than a simple content analysis. If we're doing a content analysis of the media, we'll say, what does this commercial tell us? Well, there's polar bears sharing a Coca-Cola bottle, so it must be telling us that this product will bring us together, right? But what Zizek is doing is not simply looking at the content, at the script that's going on, let's say in an advertisement, a commercial or something like that. He's looking at what within the content can tell us about the form with which we relate to one another. Again, I understand that sounds very abstract. So let me build up into this so that we can understand it a little better. And it begins with what Zizek calls ideology, I-D-E-O-L-O-G-Y, ideology. So to understand what I meant when I said that Zizek's approach moves from content to form, we need to understand what ideology is for Slavoj Zizek. On the question of ideology, I don't know why I even closed the whiteboard. On the question of ideology, what he calls ideology critique, Slavoj traces a fundamental path from the work of Karl Marx through to the work of a French Marxist named Louis Althusser, to, well, his own approach himself. So we're going to follow this path, we're going to trace this path, and we're going to take it step by step to get to what ideology critique is all about. So we begin with Karl Marx. Karl Marx, of course, many of you probably think you know quite a bit about Karl Marx, and indeed you probably do. When I was an undergraduate student, of course, everybody knew of Marx, but nobody admitted that they knew anything about Marx. Today, at least in America, we seem to talk about Marxists as if they're ideologues, you know, as if they have an axe to grind, an ideological axe to grind, a particular bias that makes them dogmatically Marxist, right? And hence their view of reality is obscured by their Marxist bias. This is how people tend to talk about the work of Karl Marx today. We hear it from Jordan Peterson, for example. For those of you familiar, he calls everybody a Marxist ideologue. It's a curious phrase, in fact, because Marx invented the very theory of ideology, in a sense. He's the one who put ideology on the table. How can it be that the person who gave us the means to critique ideology, the very first to discuss it, and to provide us with a sense of what ideology is, how it functions, what it does, and so on. How is it that he could be ideological? I mean, it's possible, and perhaps it's even true. I'm not necessarily claiming it's not, but we should at least emphasize this fact that it was Marx who gave us the notion of ideology critique, and certainly not Jordan Peterson. So Marx offers us a notion of ideology. Marx was the first to describe ideology as a mechanism of obscuration, a mechanism that obscures our view of reality, in a sense. That was Marx's position, in a really naive, simplistic sense. So it's not right. It's simply ironic that one would discuss Marxism as an ideology or a religion. Marx himself was against religion. You know, he called it the opium of the masses. So Marxism, as being some sort of dogmatic religion or cult or something, it needs to be qualified in this way. Marx was the first to draw our attention to the mechanism of ideology. It's very important. So you have to understand that Marx described our social relationships as if they were always mediated by some sort of, they were always marked by some sort of asymmetry. The social bond is asymmetrical. What does it mean? How is it asymmetrical? Well, there's basically two classes in society. I mean, for Marx, there's many more, and we can get into it, but we have to have a very simplistic view for today, okay? I'm simplifying to the extreme. There is, for Marx, immanent or inherent to the social bond, which doesn't mean that it's outside of the social bond. It's inherent to any society. There is, on the one hand, the working class, what he called the proletariat. I presume many of you are already familiar with this. There's the proletariat, who are the working class. And of course, there's the ruling class. The capitalists, if you like, who Marx referred to as many of you already know, the bourgeoisie. So we have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And I said there's an asymmetrical aspect to the social bond. That's supposed to be like a bracket thing, right? So ASS. I guess it is asymmetrical. Asymmetrical. Okay, so there's an asymmetrical relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat within the social bond, within the social group, within society. This is the first point that Marx made. We have basically two classes, and they're differentiated by being working class, ruling class, capitalist class, whatever, proletariat, bourgeoisie. And there's a lot that separates them, that makes them asymmetrical. What differentiates them? What makes them asymmetrical? I'll simply point to one curious fact. There is fundamentally no relationship between these two classes, fundamentally, for Marx. One views the world in terms of extracting profits. That's the bourgeoisie, sorry. They view the world in terms of how to generate maximum profit. As a class, that is their fundamental interest, to generate as much profit as possible. And how do they do it? By investing their own profits, a portion of their own profits, back into their industries, back into the, let's say, put it very classically and simply, into the factory, into the workplace. Reinvestment of their profit. It's a fundamental law of capitalism. Let's call it even the cornerstone of the capitalist social relationship, is the extraction of profits and the reinvestment of those profits. Marx called that, of course, the generation of surplus value. And that's on the side of the bourgeoisie. And that operates fundamentally according to a different logic than the proletariat. The proletariat do not get a surplus value off of their labor because that's cut off from them and it's given to the bourgeoisie, according to Marx. Oh, my mouse is all messed up. So any surplus value is given to the bourgeoisie. I'll give you a concrete example because I can tell that these concepts are probably sounding quite abstract at this point. Just imagine for a moment that you are working at Starbucks, okay? And you get a cappuccino, it's worth $6 effing. I don't know why, but that's how much it's worth. Okay, well, so you make, I don't know, you make how many of those in an hour? Let's say, if it's, let's say you make 100 of them in an hour, which is actually quite reasonable. Okay, see, so $600 is made there, is brought into the business. How much do you get paid in that hour? Let's say it's minimum wage. I don't know what minimum wage is, which shows you how far removed I am these days from knowing much about the working class. So you should be very critical of me for that. But let's say it's $15 or something like that. Then the net profit is $600 minus 15. That's surplus value, right? All that money was made off of you, and all you got paid was $15. That's the point, okay? You didn't get the surplus value. It's a very simplistic way of putting it. It's actually a little bit more complicated than this, but this will help you get the basic point of what distinguishes the bourgeoisie from the proletariat. What does the proletariat do with its wage, its income? It's $15 times 8 for the day or whatever. It usually, the proletariat as a class will put that into satisfying its basic needs. And today, of course, our needs include entertainment, because we're all supposed to have the right fashion sense, the right coffee, even the right televisions and the right phones and everything. So you're basically paying the bills, you're paying rent, you're buying the things that the basic things you need just to fit in with your friendship networks and so on. These are two fundamentally different ways of engaging in the world. Another way that Marx put it was he created a formula. Said CMC for the bourgeoisie. Oh, sorry, I put this in the wrong spot. CMC for the proletariat and MCM for the bourgeoisie. And if you want to make this a little bit easier, you could put numbers here like C1. My mouse is junk. Okay, just imagine that's C1 and this is C2. And over here you have MCM. The first one is M1 and the second one is M2. So how does it work? Well, the proletariat begins with a commodity, which is its labor. It sells its labor as a commodity. The person is literally bought by the company, their mind, their labor power, their mind, their body, their physical energy, and so on is purchased as a commodity. So the proletariat sells itself, its labor power, like a battery in the film The Matrix, to the bourgeoisie. And what you get is in the second step, M, which means money, your wage, $15. And then what do you do with that money? So you're following steps here, right? You sell yourself as a commodity to get money. Sorry, my mouse is just no good. Let's see if this one, no. Yeah, I can't do it. And then you, at the end of it, you get another commodity, which is, I don't know, a toaster oven, a loaf of bread, a place to live for another month, right? So you move from selling yourself as a commodity to get some money to buy commodities, things that you basically need to survive. So, you know, you can imagine you don't really get ahead. If we were to chart this, it would kind of look like this. I have a mouse somewhere, but I can't get it right now. So you get like a little bit of an increase, but certainly not a lot. The best you can hope for is moving from working class to the middle class or something like that. And the middle class is just enough to keep you satisfied so you don't rise up and revolt, according to Marx, which is ultimately what a wage is meant to do, to suppress revolt, according to Marx. What happens for the bourgeoisie is they begin already with money. Because they have so much of the money, to put it very simply, the cheddar, they can buy factories. They already begin with all the commodities they need. And so they buy your labor power, they buy shovels, they buy everything they need. And because of that, they get more money and they can reinvest in the money. So, they end up with much more money than they began with. It's an exponential thing. If you were to compare the two, the proletariat would have a modest increase in its, let's say, money, to keep it simple. Whereas the bourgeoisie, it would be like an exponential increase like this. And hence, what you get are rising class divisions. So there's an asymmetry here, according to Marx. Well, we can question Marx's basic theory. There's all kinds of room to question this basic theory and how it's mutated and shifted and changed throughout the years. And indeed, it quite has. This is the basic Marxist model, or Marxian model, I should say. But that's the basic idea, okay? But what does this have to do with ideology? What is ideology then? Ideology is a mechanism, according to Marx, by which there appears to be a common ground, a symmetry, a consistency between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, as if they're the same. There's a common ground between the 1% and the 99%. We see the world in the same way. That's ideology for Marx. You might not agree with this. Just let's put this to the side. It's not about whether we personally agree with this or not. It's about trying to understand what Marx's position is. Okay. So whenever you think that, capitalists or bourgeoisie and working class have the same fundamental interests and live in the same world and have the same needs and the same forms of suffering and so on, that you're in ideology for Karl Marx. Ideology obscures the fundamental rupture, the fundamental asymmetry between the classes, and says instead, well, we're all human. And the vote of somebody like, I don't know, Bill Gates or Elon Musk or whoever is fundamentally has the same power as my vote in the end. When we know there's such things in the United States as, there's super PACs and stuff like that. Money really does influence elections. So yes, we're all human, according to Marx, and it is true that we're all human, yes, it's true that all human lives are important and so on. But the point is that nonetheless, people live differently and disproportionately suffer because of their class position and perhaps other positions as well. If one, like, for example, I'm going to put this really simple, and it's probably a terrible example, but I want to drive this point home, what Marx is driving at. If there's somebody chained to a fence, God forbid, it's terrible, and they're hit, you can't say that the person who's chained to the fence and the person who's, I don't know, hitting the person who's chained to a fence, that they're both human, and so both of them come from the same point of view, and we should assess their point of view, as equal. Maybe the person who's hitting the person who's chained to a fence is somehow, his position is just as valid. It's a ridiculous point of view. So reducing it to this basic level, I think, can help us understand what we mean by asymmetry and what Marx meant by this sort of asymmetry. So ideology for Marx, it's a very simple concept then. It simply means you're getting an inverted image of real circumstances, of real social relationships. You're getting an inverted image of them. There are real social relationships here. And the real social relationships are grounded upon fundamental asymmetrical bonds. But we produce this image, this imaginary construct, according to Marx, that can step up and it can obscure these real relationships that exist between people and make them appear symmetrical. Marx created an analogy to help us understand what's happening. He said, it's as if we view these social relationships through ideology, presents these social relationships through a camera obscura. I don't know how many of you know what a camera obscura is. I'm not sure I can draw it for you. I could try. My mouse is giving me problems. There's always a problem with these devices. Let's say this is a box, okay? And out here, we have some sort of an object. I don't know what it is. It looks like this. Perhaps it is a pineapple. I do not know. And where are we? Well, we are standing inside the box. You can call the box, if you like, Plato's cave. Why not? So this is me, a subject of ideology. Okay, look at me. I have a trapezoid. No, I have a weird head. It's pointy on the sides because of my big ears, I think. Okay, whatever. And I'm looking in this direction, okay, at the wall over here, like shadows on a cave in a sense. And a camera obscura is produced when there's a little tiny hole in the box, such that light gets in. And the light gets in a very interesting way. It goes through the hole like this, and it completely projects an inverted image onto the wall. The pineapple's inverted, it's upside down. But this is what I see as my reality. And the question is this reality? Well, for Marx, he has a naive conception of reality. He thinks the pineapple's really straight up. You know, he really believes that. He thinks this is obscuring reality. Okay, this is how ideology functions. It obscures reality and it puts it all upside down, in a sense. Okay, well, that's good enough for now, for what we want to do with Marx's work. Marx gave us this concept of ideology, and he said it obscures real relationships and presents them as if they're harmonious, symmetrical, and there's no class divisions or anything like that, right? It's a very basic, actually, understanding of ideology, if I'm being honest with you. Forgive me, somebody just endlessly keeps calling. I just need to tell them to stop. Okay, I'm back. So now we're going to move from Marx to Louis Althusser, the second movement, before we can finally get to Slavoj Zizek's theory of film. Some of you are probably starting to intuit that it has something to do with obscuring reality, has something to do with a notion of ideology. Good. That's good enough for now. For Louis Althusser, again, you spell his name Althusser. Althusser. I wish I had more time to talk about Althusser. Very strange human being. There's so much I want to say about Althusser. Unfortunately, I can't, because we have a particular agenda why I'm talking about Althusser. You know, elephant in the room, he killed his wife, he strangled her. And then his defense was that he had a psychotic break when he was a prisoner of war. There's a whole thing here. He wrote a crazy autobiography titled The Future Lasts Forever. Curious title for a number of reasons, but let's forego all of this. Althusser, he came quite a bit later. He's a French thinker. Marx, of course, was German. Well, somewhat German. I mean, Marx was kicked out of his country, trying to settle in all kinds of different places, endlessly kicked out because he was a revolutionary. Ultimately became a stateless person living in the United Kingdom, I think, in England. But Althusser's French, more contemporary, but not quite our contemporary. And his whole mission, in a sense, was to, one, rescue the work of Karl Marx and return us to a Marxism, a Marxist form of thinking, so that we wouldn't have these naive conceptions of Marx. And two, to develop a full theory of ideology, which is what Marx didn't do. Marx quickly discussed ideology, but his real focus was to discuss the way in which capitalism functions historically. So ideology was more of an incidental theory or a peripheral marginal theory for Marx, whereas for Althusser, it was quite central to his thinking. There's a few ingredients to Althusser's theory of ideology that I want to bring to your attention. I can't give you all of the ingredients, but I'd like to give you a few that I think are important for where we're going today. The first is, how shall I do this? Imagine yourself, as Althusser asked you to do, imagine yourself walking down the street. You're walking down the street. It's a sunny day. You're in the world of whatever. My life is awesome. Like in Lego, everything is awesome. And you're crossing the street and you're just kind of whistling, totally unaware of, it's almost like you're not even a human at this point because you're just oblivious to the world. You cross the street and you hear a whistle, a loud shrieking whistle. And then a person who it occurs to you as a police officer standing in your peripheral field of vision, and he shouts out to you, "Hey, you there." You hear him, you know in your mind that he is a police officer, and you decide in this moment to turn around 180 degrees and say, "Yes," or "Yes, sir," perhaps, depending upon how respectful you are. "Yes, officer." In this moment, in this precise moment, when you turn 180 degrees to respond to the police officer, you become a subject of ideology, according to Althusser. Now, I know some of you are thinking, hell yeah, and others of you are thinking this is nonsense. But, he's trying to demonstrate a much more sophisticated theory through a concrete, admittedly kind of stupid example. What's happening? In this moment, when the police officer yells out to you, he recognizes you. In what way does he recognize you? He recognizes you as a person who's obligated to respond to a figure of the law and to recognize yourself as obedient to his command. In recognizing yourself as obedient to his command, you have become interpellated. This is his theory of interpellation. Key word is interpellation. As soon as you respond to the call of authority, according to Althusser, you become a subject, capital S, a subject of ideology. You are now an ideology. Why? Because you imagine yourself to be submissive, to be less than, to be under the control of an other. Somebody other. It might not be a police officer. Maybe it's, if you want to get really psychoanalytic about it, you can imagine when you're a child and your caregiver, your parent, yells out to you and you turn around. Same thing, So it's actually a much more sophisticated psychoanalytic theory, ultimately rooted in the work of Jacques Lacan in his theory of the mirror stage, which we won't get into. And Althusser picks this up. In fact, Althusser was in discussions with Jacques Lacan at this time. They were something like colleagues, and a lot of Althusser's work was focusing on Lacanian psychoanalytic ideas. Okay, so we understand how we become a subject of ideology. We become implicated in ideology through recognition, recognizing an other form of authority, but also through and recognition is ultimately a way of imagining who you are in relation to other people, but also through this notion, this concept of interpellation. But ultimately, it's not a police officer that makes us subjects of ideology. That's just an analogy. Where does it come from? Well, Althusser gives us a few more concrete sites where we become interpellated. Althusser basically says that power functions. I'm trying to clear everything. Power functions in the following way. We have here a building, a piece of architecture, which is meant analogously to be the way our social relations are structured by capitalism. At the base, which holds everything together, we have the basic relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which is an asymmetrical relationship. There's a class division here. And we know that ideology functions from Marx to obscure that. So it kind of stands upon it. Althusser calls ideology, sorry, where's my text? Althusser says we have a number of sites of ideology, what he calls ISAs, or ideological state apparatuses. We have a number of them, and these form the superstructure. The superstructure is everything above the base that supports the base. So ideology, of course, functions to legitimize or obscure the reality of our base economic, political relationships between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So we could, if you like, we could say like this: it rationalizes, legitimizes, whatever word you like. There's also over here what he calls the RSAs, which are repressive state apparatuses, where ideology cannot control you, where you actually realize, for example, that this base relation, sorry, my arrow is a different color, where this base relationship is exposed for what it is, the repressive state apparatuses will come down upon you. And what are they? I'll just give you a few. I'll give you maybe three that Althusser discussed. He said there's the police, there's the courts, there's the army. Okay, they control you, according to Althusser, at the level of the body. They will fundamentally, you rise up and try and have a revolution and to get rid of the class distinction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, like Occupy Wall Street tried to do or whatever. The police, the courts, the army, they will physically apprehend your body. They'll put it in prison. They'll move it away from the protest zone. They'll taser you, whatever else, right? Not always, but I mean, this is a very classical definition. And we do have reason to critique this. So if you're suspicious of this, I'm with you, but maybe not for the same reason that you're suspicious. Okay, the ideological state apparatuses. Well, I already gave you a couple examples. I'll just give you a few more. My mouse is junk. Let's see what I can think of. There's the media. So that includes newspapers, magazines, all traditional media for Althusser. There is the family. There is, the school system. Oh, he really hates the school system. He says the school system is at the forefront of ideological indoctrination, which, could be true to some extent. If I remember correctly from his essay, he says that there's no other institution or apparatus in society that takes people from the age of 5 or 6 years old out of the house and sits them down and tells them to be docile, obedient human beings, to just follow rules and so on, from the age of 5 or 6, 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 12 years minimally. And then after that, you get supplemental authority in the university and the colleges and so on, where the real ideological manipulation happens. So these are some of the sites of ideological manipulation, to put it in really dangerous terms, from Althusser. Okay. So once again, the RSAs, of which these examples down here, police, courts, and armies, are a part, and the ISAs, of which the media, family, and school are a part. There's other examples, but I'm keeping it simple. Taken together, RSAs and ISAs are the superstructure, which always serves to maintain the class relationships that are inherent to the base of our social bonds in capitalism. On the other hand, the base upholds and gives rise to the necessity for repressive state apparatuses and ideological state apparatuses. So it's this sort of circular movement here with these arrows going around. Okay. It's not important that you fully follow this analogy that I just gave from Althusser. There's a few more points that I want to mention from Althusser that may even be more important than everything I've already said, but which isn't to say that what I've already said isn't important. Ideology for Althusser is a structure. This is absolutely important. Ideology is a structure, which means that in some sense, it's like what McLuhan calls a form or an environment. We are in the environment or the form of ideology. We're always in it. Althusser says that ideology is eternal. It's timeless. You can't get outside of ideology. His exact expression, this is very important, there is no outside to ideology. We're always in it. It's a form. It's an envelope within which you put your letter. Right? It's a form. It's like the cover of a book. There's no outside to ideology. All the contents of everything we say and think and whatever, it's always within the environment of ideology. So for him, it's no different than the unconscious, because Freud said you never get outside the unconscious, really. And the unconscious is timeless, it's eternal, and so on. So ideology is like the unconscious, and indeed it is unconscious in the sense in which we don't realize how ideology structures us, how our environment structures us. Except that there is one paradoxical way outside of ideology. That's to begin by admitting that you are in ideology. So be like a fish out of water. You know, his point is that it's kind of like, you know, Alcoholics Anonymous. In Alcoholics Anonymous, step one is admitting that you have a problem, right? And then you can work your way out of it. You have to admit it first. In the same way, ideology, you must first admit that you're ideological, and then you get as a bonus prize the fact of being a little bit more outside of ideology. So follow me on this point because it's crucial and it's a bit mind-bending, okay? There is no outside to ideology. That's point one. Point two, ideology, by definition, never presents itself as ideology. Ideology will never say, I am ideological, which is why, by claiming that you're ideological, you get outside of ideology. So what does this mean? It has profound implications. If you need to pause the video and listen to that whole point again, please do so. It's crucial. If a friend of yours says to you, I always tell the truth, then you should be very suspicious of that friend, because it's almost impossible that a person always tells the truth. It's basically impossible. So you can't really trust a person who says that they always tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Courtrooms are the places where the most profound lies happen after taking the oath. But if you have a friend, and I have some of these friends, I hate to admit it, but this is what makes them my best friends, because I can trust them. They say, I always lie. Well, they're lying because it's impossible to always lie. You know, by virtue of claiming that you are a liar, you are telling the truth. This is the paradox. And it's a torsion. It's a mind-bending thing. But if you get this logic, you get what I'm saying about ideology. Ideology will never claim itself to be ideological. No, it will claim other people are ideological. The ideologue is always the one who says you are an ideologue, never the one who claims they are themselves ideologues. So when Jordan Peterson claims other people to be ideologues, he doesn't see himself as being implicated in the environment of a fundamental ideology. So the way outside of ideology is to begin with the presupposition that you are determined by your environment. It's a reflexive move, and then you say, how am I determined by my environment? And you can begin to interrogate that. You know, we used to talk about ways in which we were unconsciously racist, for example, or we had unconscious or tacit presuppositions about gender, about this and that. It's only with the reflexive move of saying, oh, wait a minute now, I'm implicated in this, that we can work our way out of it, in a sense. And this is Althusser's point. This brings us finally to Slavoj Zizek. Slavoj Zizek inherits the legacy of ideology critique in that he situates it within the realm of popular culture. Thus, as Matthew Flisfetter put it in the chapter from his book that I posted on Blackboard, cinema, the movies, cinema, film, it becomes a site of potential ideology critique. It's weird because if it's true, as we naively presuppose it to be, that Hollywood is the place of the most profound forms of ideological indoctrination. Anybody can go from rags to riches if they just work really hard, and all this other obvious ideology. It's also the place where we can get a sense of what is ideological. So the trick is not to not watch films. Somehow you'll be safeguarded from being manipulated. No, the trick is to watch films understanding that they are ideological devices. It's what Zizek calls a pervert art. What does it mean, pervert art? He takes a psychoanalytic definition of perversion. Perversion in psychoanalysis is not a bad thing. It's not like there are non-perverts and there are perverts. No, we're all perverts in a certain way. Perversion is a structure. Freud, he said at some base level, we all suffer from perversions. We all have perversions. So it's not a normative thing to say there are those perverts over there and we're not perverts. No, that's not the point. Perversion is ultimately about enjoying or being the tool of another person's enjoyment. Again, this point is quite essential as well. Perversion involves a subject who sees him, her, or themselves as a tool or an instrument of another person's enjoyment or another's enjoyment. So when you watch films, if it's a pervert art, you're not enjoying the films. You might think you're enjoying the films, says Zizek. You're sitting back, you're watching, I don't know what the latest movies are. Oh, there's some good ones. Parasite is a great movie. I don't know. You're watching whatever movie you're watching, Interstellar, whatever, Gravity. Gravity's a great movie. I love his films. You seem to be enjoying it, but what Zizek's saying is that the film's enjoying you. What does that mean that the film's enjoying? The film is teaching you how to enjoy when you're not watching the film. It shows you modes of enjoyment. It shows you how to enjoy yourself, how to properly enjoy yourself. And in this sense, they're ideological machines because they teach you how to enjoy yourself. So how does one engage in ideological critique and ideology critique for Zizek? It's an advancement upon Althusser because he adds this dimension of stimulation of enjoyment, of jouissance, a French word that I'm going to make more and more use of. Let's slow down just a little bit to emphasize this point. Slavoj Zizek, we need to be clear about Althusser's definition of ideology and how Zizek makes use of it. Remember that Althusser claimed that there's no outside to ideology. So paradoxically, we are always inside of ideology, and all the more inside of ideology precisely when we claim that we're outside of it. So when Fox News says this is the no spin zone, that is precisely the space of spin. When somebody claims everything's fake news and somehow they are not, that means that their news is all the more fake in a structural sense, purely in a structural sense, not in terms of necessarily in terms of content, though indeed it could be that as well. In the good old days, we used to believe that we were inherently biased when we gave the news. Now we have to be objective and so on, which means ideological. So the only way to get outside of ideology is to accept and recognize oneself as a subject of ideology. It's really weird. When I was in India, believe it or not, I was working as a very minor actor in Bollywood. And I discussed some of my crazy ideas there about Bollywood films with some of the other actors and actresses. They were surprisingly receptive to it in a way that people over here in the American continent are not as receptive to these ideas. I was proposing a bit like, I don't know if you've seen the film The Truman Show. with Jim Carrey. It's a great old film. If you know it, you know what I'm talking about. We have this naive distinction between reality, even Marx had it, I pointed at it earlier, between reality and the screen, or the images on the screen, as if the screen is over there and it's make-believe, and reality is over here and it's concrete, objective, factual, and so on. And I said, this is a naive distinction. It's much more like a camera obscura, in the sense that the image bends back and affects reality itself. What do I mean by that? I claim that the demarcation between the screen and reality is a false one. And this is also Zizek's point. Because in some sense, the cinema screen and the images on it, the movies, they often feel more real than reality itself. And precisely, they teach us how to engage in reality, how to enjoy ourselves in reality. It's as if cinema is responsible for organizing our realities for us. There's no reality outside of the movies. I mean, I'm saying that to be a bit provocative. I'm just trying to provoke you a little bit, but it's a dramatic claim meant to provoke you. Imagine as if there's no reality outside of the movies. You know, the other day, for example, I was sitting right where I'm sitting now, giving a lecture for another class, and I heard a person walking down the street singing at the top of his lungs. It was as if he was in a musical. La La Land. It reminded me of the film La La Land. And I have no doubt that he learned that from somewhere. Again, no normative judgments. It's just, it's interesting. So let's take it a little bit further. I mean, you know, in Bollywood films, there's this endless music, and the emotions are even more dramatic and heightened than what Westerners, to some extent, feel acceptable. They feel it. They feel, a lot of Westerners, when they first watch Bollywood films, they feel like it's too fake. Since, you know, we're supposed to have more realism in film. But what's interesting is that these fake emotions and this intensified music really works, and they make us feel things in the real world. They teach us how to act outside of the screen. You know, my Bollywood friends were just as dramatic outside of the screen, perhaps more dramatic than they were on the screen. I'll give maybe a better example that maybe will convince you a little bit more. When I was very young, growing up, there was a small family-owned cinema around the corner from where I lived. And when I went in, there was 2 screens, and they would project the same movie on both these screens simultaneously, but they were right beside each other, separated just a little bit. I felt cross-eyed watching it sometimes. It was as if they intended to put a screen for each eye that we have, a screen for the right eye and a screen for the left eye. And I don't think this is by a mistake, that even a lot of classrooms have it set up this way. A screen for, they'll say, the right side of the class and the left side of the class, but it's almost like the screen is an extension of the eyes. Or our eyes as extensions of the screens, even, both ways. What could it mean? I'm going to take it back a little bit, because I hope to end on this point, because it seems really silly, but it's an important point. There's a great film commented upon at length by Slavoj Zizek to explain what ideology is. It's a film called They Live. I could have posted it for you to watch, and perhaps in retrospect, I should have. Those of you who want to watch a little bit, even just a clip on YouTube, you can find this very easily, They Live, on YouTube. Please do so. But I'll narrate what's happening in the movie just a little tiny bit for you. I'm taking this from Slavoj Zizek too. These are not my ideas. These are Zizek's ideas. What's happening is that there's a drifter, basically a homeless man, fairly well-dressed homeless man, a drifter, a guy who just kind of, he does what the French call a dérive, which means to just sort of wander and let the city move you. And he's doing this. He's in his everyday world, just like the gentleman I discussed earlier who's crossing the street and he sees the police officer. He's in his whatever reality, right? He hasn't been interpellated yet. He's in the whatever reality, or at least he doesn't think he's interpellated yet. And he breaks into a church, and he pulls out a box full of sunglasses, just full of these sunglasses, and he steals a pair, and he leaves. Okay, he's walking down the street, and he's in the city. These are modern times of urbanization. There's crowds, there's transactions happening on the street, people buying magazines, there's billboards, all this stuff happening all around him. Businessmen walking beside him in suits. And the sun's bright, so he puts on his sunglasses. Immediately in this moment, he puts on the sunglasses, he starts to see things in his reality that weren't there before. The businessmen look like skeletons, evil skeletons, like lifeless. He sees somebody holding a dollar bill and it says on it, "This is your God." He takes off the glasses, now it's just money, it doesn't say it anymore. He sees a billboard that has an advertisement to go to Cancun, and he puts on the glasses, it says, "Marry, have children and work and die," or something like that. You know, only when he puts the glasses on. So what's the point? The point is that the glasses are theory. The glasses are ideology critique. The glasses are Slavoj Zizek. The glasses are sociological theory. The glasses are media ecology. How? When you put them on, you're seeing the same world, but you're seeing what was already in that world, but that you didn't see before. You're seeing what was obscured in your world. So what's the trick? The trick is that ideology is there when he's not wearing the glasses. When he puts the glasses on, the ideology is still there. It's just he can see ideology for what it is. He sees himself as a subject of ideology, finally. And in some sense, he's free. He steps out of the camera obscura into outside of Plato's cave, out in the real world. And now his trick is to try and convince other people that they're immersed in ideology. It's a difficult thing. You know, there's even a violent scene where he's trying to convince somebody to look through the glasses, look through the world, look at the world through Marxist glasses, if you like. And the guy's fighting. He doesn't want to. He wants to live in his naive reality. He has to be forced to put on the glasses. So it's not then, as some people naively claim, that ideology is when you put on the glasses and you take them off and you're not ideological, you can see things in their factual, objective reality. Not at all. For Zizek and in his reading of Althusser and Marx, what's going on is that it's precisely when you're not wearing the glasses, when you don't think you're ideological, that you're so intensely ideological. And when you put on the glasses, you see that you're a subject of ideology, that you're interpellated, and so on. And you can finally do something significant, maybe something revolutionary. But you can feel quite alienated in doing so. I'm going to stop there. Best wishes.